Natalie Brett, for those that don't know me, I'm the head of college here, and I have this other fabulous title called Pro-Vice Chancellor for the International in the university. A very warm welcome to everybody, regardless of whether you're somebody from within LCC and the university, or we've got a lot of VIP guests here tonight as well, so welcome to all of you, and others as well that have come in for this. I'm going to introduce Lara in a moment, but this is this time last year, we had our Screen School launch, and Lord Putnam did the keynote for us, and this is part now of what we want to do on an annual basis with what we're calling the Kubrick Lecture. So I'll let Lara talk to you more about that. We've got a fantastic exhibition as part of this talk tonight and everything else that we're doing over the next pretty much a month there, as you can see from the dates. But before I do anything else, I'm going to introduce you to, it's a great title this, and I did come up with it myself, the Dean of Screen. So please, Lara Anderson, thank you.
Good evening. It's always good to get that laugh out of the way. Welcome to the London College of Communication at the University of Arts London. And thank you for coming to the inaugural lecture, Stanley Kubrick Lecture, as launched by the college's Screen School. Tonight we celebrate the 10-year anniversary of the Stanley Kubrick Archive at the university's Archives and Special Collections Center here at the college. The archive represents more than 1,000 boxes of material meticulously collected by the director himself and previously housed at his home. Documents include annotated scripts, photographs, recordings, and research for his films from a collection of objects that offer an in-depth insight into the methodical approach taken by one of the most well-known and respected filmmakers of all time. The collection offers a personal account of a visionary and detailed filmmaking process which continues to have a major impact on both viewers and filmmakers alike today. It is our intention at the LCC Screen School to help activate that archive and to ensure it grows and influences a source of inspiration and knowledge for academics, artists, and students alike in their explorations of both the artistry and the history of inspired and rigorous filmmaking practice. Thus, the exhibition you will see tonight, Beyond 2001 New Horizons, highlights new work which has been generated directly out of research into and interaction with the materials of the archive itself. But first, we have invited one of the archive's key researchers to deliver the inaugural Stanley Kubrick Lecture, an upcoming series of lectures generated by researchers who have delved into the Stanley Kubrick Archive and returned with new knowledge and perspectives on the filmmaker and filmmaking itself. Leading us in the conversation tonight is the regarded academic and film critic Peter Krämer. Mr. Krämer is Senior Fellow at the School of Art, Media, and American Studies at the University of East Anglia. He is the author and editor of 8 books, including 2 BFI film classics on Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb, and 2001 A Space Odyssey, as well as a volume on A Clockwork Orange and Palgrave's Controversy series, and the Stanley Kubrick New Perspectives, which he co-edited with Tatiana Jujic and our own Stanley Kubrick archivist, Richard Daniels. He has also published numerous essays on the career and films of Stanley Kubrick, taught on the filmmaker, spoken about him at public events, and contributed to podcasts and new Blu-ray editions of his films. Therefore, I would like to warmly welcome to the stage Peter Krämer.
Thank you very much. The title of my lecture is The Future of Humanity, Then and Now. Now, I want to give you one picture. I'm not going to say anything about it now. Can you all hear me okay? Yes. I'm going to just leave it there, and I'm going to mention it later. Also, the last picture in my slideshow, I will also, it might be a bit unsettling, disturbing, challenging, but I will also leave it up. So it's not a mistake, but I will do it on purpose. So you might want to contemplate that image, or you might just want to listen to me, or maybe you do both. I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to present this lecture, which is meant to explore and celebrate the work of Stanley Kubrick, and also to explore and celebrate the rich resources of the Stanley Kubrick Archive here at the University of the Arts London. So it is, I think, entirely appropriate to start this lecture with some nuggets from the archive. When Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb, was first widely shown to the public at the beginning of 1964, Stanley Kubrick received a lot of letters from audience members. The film shows how the actions of a rogue American general, in conjunction with a series of unfortunate coincidences, lead to the explosion of a Soviet doomsday device which will destroy all life on the surface of the Earth. Earth, globe, connections will emerge in the course of me speaking. Several letter writers, people who just wrote to Kubrick, commented on the fact that the film was full of, and here's the nugget bit, sexual imagery and wordplay, which linked the rogue general called Jack the Ripper and other characters who helped to bring about the end of the world as we know it to a deeply dysfunctional male sexuality, notably a paranoid fear of women and an obsession with phallic power. Now you might say, well, it's just typical academic talk, they just make stuff up. But I'm not talking as a critic, I'm talking about someone who looks at the letters that people wrote to Kubrick, just regular cinema goers writing to Kubrick about what they seen on the screen. So one letter writer commented on, I quote, "the opening shots of that great phallus sticking it to us all." He refers to the in-flight refueling procedure involving two planes, which is shown under the film's credits. Kubrick did not respond to this particular letter, but in an exchange with another correspondent, he stated, the intention was to make an irreverent sexual joke at the start of the film in order to create the right mood. So this is Kubrick writing. Another letter writer asked, was I correct in interpreting the catalytic agent of the whole nightmare as Jack Ripper's fear of impotence, which put him in an active psychotic state? To this question, Kubrick replied, your assumption is correct, but obviously the film is a bit more involved than just a psychological tragedy. While Kubrick thus cautioned against a reductive psychological interpretation of Dr. Strangelove, he welcomed the analysis of yet another correspondent who referenced, I quote, our paranoid, infantile, self-protective sexual folkways, and the fact that the film was, I quote, structured formally as a kind of duplication of sexual intercourse. Kubrick replied, you are the first who seems to have noticed the sexual framework from intramission to the last spasm. This is Kubrick. This is not some crazy critic like me. This is Kubrick writing about his film. You are the first who seems to have noticed the sexual framework from intramission to the last spasm. Now, this last spasm occurs after an enthusiastically screaming Major Kong who has dropped from a plane with a huge nuclear bomb sticking out between his legs, hits the ground. That's the last spasm. Kong's ultimate orgasm is going to lead to the deaths of billions of people. The film makes that clear. Such an incomprehensibly large number of deaths was in fact what Kubrick thought to be the most likely outcome of the Cold War nuclear confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union. He said so repeatedly in both private and public statements throughout the 1960s. So we have to take this very, very seriously. There's a joke in here, but there's something very, very serious about it. He personally was convinced that humanity was very unlikely to survive the 20th century. In his production notes for Dr. Strangelove, he wrote that there's no technical solution to the threat of nuclear war, and also no political solution. I quote, disarmament, even without cheating, but unaccompanied by a profound moral change of attitudes in men and nations, could easily lead to a sudden rearmament and war. You can't take away knowledge. The only defense is the mind of man, and I don't think he has even begun to face the problem. Kubrick probably intended man to refer to humanity as a whole here, but his responses to the letters I cited earlier suggest that in fact he thought that it was specifically the male mind which needed to be transformed. Arguably, this is exactly what his next film, 2001: A Space Odyssey, set out to achieve. Now I want you to keep this claim of mine, and also Kubrick's symbolic use of sexual imagery and ideas, in mind when I now turn to the main topic of my lecture, 2001: A Space Odyssey. This year we are celebrating the 50th anniversary of what is widely regarded as Kubrick's greatest masterpiece, which was originally released into cinemas in April 1968. The future that Kubrick and his co-writer Arthur C. Clarke envisioned 50 years ago for the year 2001 has not come to pass. Neither in that year nor in subsequent years have there been giant space stations orbiting the Earth or permanent bases on the Moon. In fact, for more than 4 decades, no human being has gone beyond near-Earth orbit, and certainly not all the way to Jupiter. No alien artifacts have been discovered on the Moon, on Earth, or anywhere else in our solar system. Indeed, over half a century of intensive research has produced absolutely no evidence that there's life elsewhere in the universe, let alone intelligent life. For all we know, life is confined to our planet. And despite persistent talk about a return to the Moon or a mission to Mars as first steps towards the colonization of the solar system, there's little indication that any human beings are actually going to leave the Earth behind in the foreseeable future. In fact, rather than beginning to open up the vastness of the universe for human habitation, the most profound effect of space travel up to this point has been a heightened awareness of our limitations. This planet is all we have and all we are ever likely to have, and it is finite. Indeed, viewed from space, it can look rather small and fragile against the backdrop of the largely empty blackness of space. This is best exemplified by 2 iconic photographs taken by astronauts, which are among the most widely reproduced images in history and have been adopted by the modern environmental movement that emerged in the 1960s and 1970s. The Blue Marble from December 1972 and Earthrise from December 1968. But before Earthrise, there were, of course, the moving images of Earth as seen from space in 2001: A Space Odyssey. These are first presented in the film's credit sequence. The globe is shown again right after the prehistoric dawn of man sequence in the initial scenes depicting Heywood Floyd's journey to the Moon. The film also features images of the globe at its conclusion, when David Bowman, having been transformed into a star child, finally returns home after a long odyssey and contemplates our blue planet. At key points in the film, images of the globe are closely associated with new beginnings. The credit sequence shows, among other things, the sun rising above the Earth, and both rising above the Moon, signaling the start of a new day. This is echoed by the dawning of a new day on Earth in the first few shots of the film's prehistoric African sequence, which goes on to depict the dawning of intelligence in ape-like creatures, or hominids. One might say that with a little help from a black rectangular monolith, Mother Earth is shown to give birth to humanity. Indeed, some of the images in the credit sequence would appear to evoke a baby bump and a breast with a nipple. Much like the coupling of airplanes in the credit sequence of Dr. Strangelove was meant by Kubrick to evoke sexual penetration. Let's take another look at the film's credit sequence. Now, this lecture is about how technology fails us. I never use technology in my talks, but I made an exception for this prestigious event tonight. And of course, it failed me, because what you don't see is the Moon here. We couldn't make it work. And so my argument that what you see here, and I tried this with students, the baby bump and a breast with a nipple. So this is the beginning of the film. In fact, let's take another look at the film's ending. Isn't this a bit like a before and after birth sequence? So imagine the baby bump, breast with nipple. Baby looking at the mother's belly, maybe with another one on the way. The trip to the Moon sequence, which follows the prehistoric dawn of man, reveals that some of Mother Earth's human children are trying to leave her, at least temporarily. It is noticeable that neither in the spacecraft nor in the space station do travelers pay any attention to the glorious images of the globe visible through windows in the background. Instead, they sleep, watch television, make video phone calls, or chat with each other. It seems that they take our blue planet for granted. What is more, and this is quite remarkable, after the prehistoric sequence, not a single of the film's scenes is set on Earth. The closest we come to life on the planet's surface is when space travelers stare at screens displaying scenes taking place on Earth. With only one exception, all of these show people in rooms, and most of them are presented merely as talking heads. So we never see Earth again. What we see of the future is completely divorced from Earth. People in the film are completely divorced, and we as viewers are completely divorced from life on Earth. At the end of the story, a story which not coincidentally is full of sunrises and birthdays, one of Mother Earth's children is reborn due to the intervention of another monolith. This event suggesting the possibility of rebirth for all of humanity. Crucially, the Star Child's first act is to return to Mother Earth and with eyes wide open to look at her and then at us. In connection with the film's opening sequence, this final look can be understood as an invitation or a challenge for us to look around at and to reconnect with our planet's ecosphere, which once gave rise to and still provides the absolutely necessary foundation for human life. Indeed, the film might be taken to suggest that humanity will have to undergo, and is indeed capable of undergoing, a radical transformation so as to overcome its alienation from Mother Earth, and thus to ensure its survival. More specifically, the film strongly suggests that there's a particular problem with men. The Dawn of Man sequence traces the origins of humanity to a male hominid's realization that he can use a phallic bone as a weapon with which to kill animals and members of his own species. Humans, and most especially the males of the species, are thus defined as murderous, meat-eating tool users. That's us, murderous, meat-eating tool users, especially the males of the species. In the Jupiter mission sequence, drama arises from the mistakes and murderous actions of Hell, a male-identified computer whose actions echo the first killings depicted in the Dawn of Man sequence. The most advanced creation of human beings, a technological extension of man, turns against them, amongst other things by withdrawing artificial life support. Whereas Mother Earth gives life, male-identified technology is liable to destroy it. In response to all this, the film shows the fetus-like newborn star child to be unsexed. It is neither male nor female. And while the star child seems to need the proximity of Mother Earth, it is, as far as we can see, no longer dependent on tools and technology. Such a transformation is, the film implies, necessary not only because it is, as Kubrick argued in his comments on Dr. Strangelove, the only way to avoid nuclear war, but also because human uses of technology have gradually been destroying the natural environment, an issue that gained a lot of attention in the United States and elsewhere in the second half of the 1960s, as did the rapid growth of the world's human population, which was expected to lead not only to higher levels of environmental destruction, but also to devastating resource shortages. Now, the dangers of nuclear weapons and of overpopulation, as well as humanity's utter dependence on its natural environment, were discussed at great length in treatments and script drafts for 2001: A Space Odyssey. In the novel Clarke wrote to accompany the film's release, in interviews Kubrick and Clarke gave at the time, and in various marketing materials, such as the souvenir booklet cinema audiences could purchase. So I'm now talking a little bit about the material that's not in the film, but I guess it supports what I'm trying to say about the film. So I'll give you a few examples. I can't give too many, but I'll give a couple of examples of how these topics, which are not obvious in the film, absolutely informed its production process. So the first draft outline from July 1964 of what was then labeled Project Space includes the following passage about the American moon base. I quote, "Ironically, many of the skills that had been used to build this underground empire had been developed during the decades of the Cold War. Here on the moon were the same arts and hardware of underground living and protection against a hostile environment, but they had been turned to the purposes of peace. This represented something new in the history of man. After 10,000 years, he had at last found something as exciting as war." A screenplay from July 1965 begins, like Clarke's later novel, with an environmental threat to the survival of man-apes. "The remorseless drought had lasted for 10 million years," is the first sentence. The implication being that they're going to die very soon, unless something happens, like a monolith. So an environmental threat is at the heart of the story, at least the prehistoric part. And the transition from that prehistoric part to the trip to the moon sequence was accompanied in the July 1965 screenplay by the following voice-over narration, with similar commentary also appearing in Clarke's novel. And I quote from the screenplay, "By the year 2001, overpopulation had replaced the problem of starvation, but this was ominously offset by the absolute and utter perfection of the bomb." I want to suggest that it is these concerns about threats to human survival which underpin not only Kubrick and Clarke's interest in the story of 2001, but also the film's impact on audiences. What the film has to offer in response to a threatening reality is precisely a hopeful vision of the possibility of radical transformation, a sense of boundless human potential. As we will see, many viewers of 2001 were indeed deeply affected along these lines by the film. And some were inspired to take their lives in new directions. That's something I'm particularly fascinated by, that a film can insert real power over people's lives. Now, I would certainly include myself in this category of people whose life have been changed by the film. As a teenager who read vast amounts of science fiction and worried a lot about the state of the world, I was so strongly affected by my first viewing of 2001 in the late 70s that after also reading Clarke's novel and seeing Kubrick's next film, A Clockwork Orange, it occurred to me that perhaps it might be worth, guess what, studying movies. I don't come from a background where that idea would find a lot of support, but it seemed very striking. A few years later, I did indeed embark on a film studies degree at university. And studying and teaching and writing about movies is what I've done ever since. However, for a long time my work did not touch on the films that had inspired my career choice. Only in the late 1990s did I return to 2001: A Space Odyssey and A Clockwork Orange, doing some archival research, guess what, in the United States. Because this was before the Kubrick Archive opened. And working towards a couple of conference papers which are presented in the noughties, at which time I also started teaching a course on Kubrick at my university. Then, on a fateful day in 2008, I visited the then recently opened Stanley Kubrick Archive here at the University of the Arts London for the first time. Confronted with, and to be honest, initially quite overwhelmed by, the incredible richness of this collection, I could not help but dedicate the better part of the decade that has followed that first visit to the study of Kubrick's films. Now, 2001: A Space Odyssey has continued to be the main focus of my fascination with Kubrick's work, and of my thinking about Kubrick and about contemporary cinema more generally. But the basis for my fascination with and thinking about 2001 is different now from what it had been before I started spending many hours in the Stanley Kubrick Archive. That's what's called research. You know what I mean? Like I try to tell this to my students. If you know what you're going to find before you do the research, it's not research. It's good guessing. Or it's a bad case of confirmation bias. You only find what you're looking for. So before I started my research in the Kubrick Archive, I used to subscribe to 3 truths that most critics and scholars writing about 2001 seem to agree on. Number 1. Kubrick conceived of 2001 as a big-budget avant-garde movie. Number 2, the film's outlook on the future was in line with his well-known pessimism. focusing on dehumanized space travelers and a malfunctioning computer that appears more human than its flesh and blood counterparts. Number 3, not surprisingly, upon its initial release, the film was rejected both by most established critics and by cinema audiences. And it only belatedly became a success when it was embraced by a new generation of critics and by youth audiences, many of whom watched the film under the influence of mind-altering substances. This is virtually what you read, versions of this you read in virtually every publication on 2001. Now, the more I engaged with the material contained in the Stanley Kubrick Archive, the more I became convinced that all 3 statements are blatantly false. Whether that will change what people write about the film is a different question. But I have to come to the conclusion that they're all 3 of them false. I have gathered a lot of the relevant evidence in my publications on the film, but today I can only present a few exemplary pieces of evidence to you. But to begin with, it is worth situating 2001: A Space Odyssey in the context of Kubrick's overall career, because that sort of influences how we might want to understand the film. Born in 1928 in New York, already as a teenager, Kubrick was employed as a photographer at Look, a mass-market picture magazine. I think the estimate is that it had a readership of 10 million a week. Extraordinary readership. That's what he serviced every single week or month. When he switched to filmmaking in the early 1950s, he made several short documentaries, the first 2 of which were released into movie theaters by RKO, one of the big Hollywood studios. He also worked as a second unit director for a television miniseries on Lincoln, which was shown on the CBS network. Not on some, local station, but on the big CBS network. Look magazine, RKO, CBS. He also developed a feature-length war movie entitled Fear and Desire, which he intended, but failed, to sell to the Hollywood majors. All of his subsequent films were released, and most of them also financed by the major studios. In other words, from the very beginnings of and throughout his career, Kubrick was working at or near the very center of the American entertainment industry, rather than at its margins. Having become accustomed early on to millions of readers seeing his photographs in Look magazine, Kubrick did want to reach as many people as possible with his films as well. And while he always tried to maintain creative control over his projects, Kubrick's work was also informed by financial considerations. How could it be otherwise? Some of his projects required substantial budgets, and the best way to justify such budgets was a good commercial track record. However, none of his first 4 features, Fear and Desire, 1953, the urban crime films Killer's Kiss, 1955, and The Killing, 1956, as well as the World War I drama Paths of Glory, 1957, succeeded at the box office. Although they did establish Kubrick's reputation as one of Hollywood's most critically acclaimed young filmmakers, they also established the main themes of his work, which I would characterize as male violence in all its forms, and its connections with men's sexual desire for, and their wholly dysfunctional relationships with, women. The enormous success of the mega-budget Roman epic Spartacus, 1960, for which Kubrick was hired as a replacement for the film's original director Anthony Mann, then turned him into a powerful player in Hollywood. There's the commercial track record, because the success of Spartacus was so massive that even that one film constituted a very good track record at that moment in time for Kubrick. And this position as a major Hollywood player was confirmed by the commercial and critical success of his next 2 films, the scandalous bestseller adaptation Lolita, 1962, and Dr. Strangelove. Soon after the release of Dr. Strangelove, Kubrick wrote to Arthur C. Clarke and thus embarked on developing a story which would provide the foundation for his next film, 2001: A Space Odyssey, and for a novel to be published under Clarke's name. On the basis of a very extensive treatment, jointly written by Kubrick and Clarke, and entitled Journey Beyond the Stars, MGM decided at the beginning of 1965 to finance and distribute the movie, which, like Lolita and Dr. Strangelove, was to be made in the UK. So, could this movie that was going to be developed here conceivably be an avant-garde movie? Could that have been on anyone's mind? Now, from the press release issued by MGM in February 1965, with the headline, Stanley Kubrick to film Journey Beyond the Stars in Cinerama for MGM, we can deduce that the studio considered this one of its most important forthcoming productions. At that time, very few titles carried the Cinerama label, which indicated that the film in question would initially be shown on 70mm as a special so-called roadshow attraction with higher than usual ticket prices, bookable seats, and an orchestral overture as well as an intermission in a small number of Cinerama theaters with their huge curved screens. The film's initial budget of $6 million was 4 times the cost of the average Hollywood movie at the time. Now, it's not fair to translate it, but the average Hollywood movie today costs what? 60, 70 million? This 6 million was 4 times the average budget for a Hollywood movie. It's not a fair comparison, but just to put things a little bit in perspective here. This was never going to be intended as an avant-garde movie. Now, few science fiction movies had ever been successful at the box office at that moment in time. So from the outset, Kubrick and MGM conceptualized and publicized their forthcoming production very differently from science fiction, or from the kind of science fiction that had been circulated before. They publicized it as the latest work of one of Hollywood's leading filmmakers, with a good commercial track record. Spartacus, Lolita, Dr. Strangelove, 3 hits in a row. Very rare in Hollywood. As what was, in the context of the ongoing space race, a highly topical production. You read about it in the newspaper, watch it in the movie theater. As a scientifically based depiction of future developments, rather than yet another futuristic fantasy. Also as an extension, and that's something people forget, as the hugely successful original Cinerama travelogues from the 1950s, because that's the original Cinerama format, was actually 3 cameras, 3 projectors, and they were travelogues. They took you around interesting places, put you on roller coasters and such. So 2001: A Space Odyssey, or Journey Beyond the Stars, was publicized as an extension of this kind of travelogue into space. And it also, of course, was advertised, publicized, conceptualized as an epic movie, which, far exceeding the scope of the historical and biblical epics that had dominated the US box office since the late 1940s, would capture an utterly transformative moment in human history, namely the encounter with extraterrestrial intelligence. That surely must be up there with, the founding of the Christian religion and church. You know what I mean? It's and some people, of course, later said, well, maybe the film is about the second coming. So this connection with what are the most fundamentally transformative moments in human history, from a Western point of view, it would be the beginning of Christianity. And it was on that level that this film was advertised, conceptualized, publicized right from the get-go. It's an epic movie. Now, originally scheduled for release at the end of 1966, the production, soon retitled From Journey Beyond the Stars to 2001: A Space Odyssey, fell far behind schedule and almost doubled its budget. I mean, now you can't even calculate it in today's money. That's impossible. It's almost doubling, so it's, what did I say, 4 times, it's actually 7 times the average budget. Unimaginable today, to make a movie that is 7 times the average budget of a Hollywood movie. It's completely unimaginable to do that today. But that's the kind of production that 2001 became. This was mainly due to very extensive and highly complex special effects work. With the revised release date of April 1968 coming closer, 2001 then became the subject of what was, not surprisingly, at the time described by the leading film industry trade paper Variety as, this is a mega budget film. MGM puts everything behind it. So Variety writes about the most extensive, in-depth advertising, publicity, and promotional campaign in the studio's history. This is the studio of Gone with the Wind. Yeah? So Variety says no film ever in MGM history has been promoted as heavily as 2001: A Space Odyssey. So again, that should put your mind at rest somewhat about this claim that, whoa, it's an avant-garde movie. I'm actually going to say something about that. It is avant-garde, but it's also a blockbuster. Now, the interesting thing is that special efforts were made to appeal to women and children. in the promotion of this film. There was jewelry, there was toys, all of this as merchandise tied in to the release of the film. After all, Hollywood's roadshow releases had long served as rare occasions for the whole family to go to the movies together. So there were special efforts made for women and children to bring them into the cinema. In the months before the release of 2001, Kubrick, and now we come to the avant-garde bit. This is a few months before the film was released. This is not at the beginning. This is a few months after they'd worked on it for several years. Kubrick made a series of rather surprising decisions about the shape the film would take. For a long time, 2001 was meant to have had a prologue in which scientists discuss topics relevant for understanding the film, extensive voice-over commentary, as well as long dialogue sequences explaining what is happening in the story and why. My favorite is the one where hell becomes schizophrenic, and there's a good and a bad hell, and they interview the good hell to explain why the bad hell is killing people. Endless dialogue sequences at the script stage. I don't think any of those were filmed. And also there was meant to have been a conventional orchestral score. But Kubrick eventually decided that the aim of sensually, emotionally, and intellectually engaging the audience was better served by dropping prologue, voiceover, and a lot of dialogue. Thus, as a side effect, removing all explicit references to nuclear weapons, environmental issues, and overpopulation from the film. Up to this point, the film was full of this stuff. At the moment when Kubrick makes this decision, all of this disappears from the film. He also replaced the specially composed score with existing recordings of classical and modernist music, which had never been done before in a mainstream movie. Given the high financial stakes, 7 times the budget of an average movie, Kubrick obviously did not do this to alienate the audience. You're like an avant-garde movie, makes you think about the plasticity of the film strip and the nature of the medium. Obviously, that was not his intention. Hang on, I lost my place. But he did this because he thought that in this way, the film would affect viewers more deeply. That was his thinking. If I take all of this stuff out, I can affect viewers more deeply than before. And the MGM executives he was working with must have had confidence in his judgment, or perhaps they were distracted by the corporate turmoil the studio was undergoing at the time, because they did not interfere. This is an extraordinary moment in film history. You know, a super expensive film, the filmmaker decides to take everything out that explains what's going on in the movie, because he has a hunch that he can reach more audiences more deeply this way. And the studio that puts the money into this production says, all right. It's an unthinkable moment. And it hasn't really been explained whether they were simply not paying attention or whether they truly trusted him at that moment. There's some interesting research by James Fenwick at DMU on this. But that's an extraordinary moment that no one interfered at this point and said, look, we're going to take the film away from you. It's our money. We do with it what we want. That didn't happen. They must have trusted him, or they were just so worked up about other things that they couldn't even bother. I'm not sure. I like to think it's trust. Now, Kubrick himself was perfectly willing to admit that perhaps he had gone too far. You know, we always hear about Kubrick, once it's done, it's done. No, it isn't. After the first public screenings of 2001, he decided to cut 19 minutes from the film so as to speed up the action a little bit. I like to tell students or introductions audiences, Hitchcock said, movies, it's like life with the boring bits cut out. Not in 2001. But the boring bits become an experience in their own right. But Kubrick was willing to say, I've gone too far. 19 minutes of stuff I can cut out. And no one has fully reconstructed what those might be, I don't think. But one day maybe we'll learn more about this. Interestingly, he also was willing to add 2 intertitles. Jupiter Mission 18 Months Later and Jupiter Beyond the Infinite. They were added. And a strategically placed shot of the monolith was added so as to explain what was happening. So it's not that Kubrick was completely focused on making everyone confused. He wanted a balance between a certain level of experiencing the film at an emotional, sensual level, and also intellectually trying to figure out what's going on, but also giving the audience enough clues to go on. So he was perfectly willing to change after the first screenings. Then, however, it was locked down. But even after he had cut 19 minutes and added 2 intertitles and a strategically placed shot of the monolith, the film retained an overwhelming sense of mystery, as it does, in fact, self-consciously acknowledge in its last line of dialogue, which comes at the end of Heywood Floyd's pre-recorded message concerning the monolith discovered on the moon. And this last line of dialogue is, its origin and purpose is still a total mystery. It's almost like, whoa, 2001: A Space Odyssey, the movie, its origin and purpose. So it tries to maintain that sense of utter mystery. In fact, the film arguably was just as perfectly designed and in many ways just as opaque as the monoliths that set its story in motion and bring it to a conclusion. Mad Magazine, as so often, figured that one out. So in the Mad Magazine version of 2001, some astronauts at the end land on Jupiter or whatever, or Jupiter moon, and find a monolith. And they open the monolith because it turns out it's a book. And the title of the book, once they have opened it, is How to Make a Completely Incomprehensible Movie and a Lot of Money with It. So Mad Magazine figured out that the monolith that creates humanity and moves humanity to the next level of its evolution is like the film. The film is like the monolith. The implication, of course, being that the film could do to us what the monoliths do to the hominids and the humans in the film. And I was actually quite pleased when in the Kubrick Archive I found a letter which said exactly that. One woman said, "Dear Mr. Kubrick, I have to tell you, your film did to me what the monoliths did to the race of man. It elevated me to a higher level." I was very pleased when I saw that. But I was equally pleased when I saw that Mad Magazine had already figured that one out. Now, you might think this is still setting up the film for commercial failure. You might still think that this is so unusual what's going on here, that the film would have been a failure, that the story is about audiences rejecting it and even established critics rejecting it. Sound very convincing. And you can always find 3 reviews and 5 letters which say exactly that. Yet judging by the many letters that Kubrick received from regular cinema goers, rather than professional critics and filmmakers in the late 60s and early 70s, it seemed to have been quite easy for many people to make sense of and enjoy the film on a fundamental level. By fundamental, I don't mean simple. I mean at what makes us human almost, at that level. People were able to connect to the film at the most fundamental level of their being. True to its title, 2001: A Space Odyssey obviously took the audience on an exciting journey through time and space. I mean, it says it does what it says on the tin. 2001: A Space Odyssey, that's what the film does. It was also quite obvious that the film dealt with the very beginnings of humanity and what might be the next stage in its evolution. Or as many correspondents wrote, its main theme was birth and rebirth. Not only or primarily in a biological sense, although quite a few letters commented on the film's sexual imagery, but in terms of the ever-present possibility of radical transformation. Transformation of each individual. We all have that potential. The cinema has the potential of transformation. And 2001 was understood to be the film that would transform what cinema is. The whole culture could be transformed. Contemporary society could be transformed. Perhaps even humanity as a whole. Despite the persistent claims of critics and scholars about the film's pessimism, 2001 was thus widely understood by cinema goers to have a hopeful message. And I'd like to think that Kubrick intended it to have a hopeful message. Although there's some conflicting evidence, both on the part of Kubrick and Clarke, about what they thought people might make of the film or should make of the film. For example, one man writing to Kubrick in June 1968 compared 2001 to Dr. Strangelove, whereas he found the latter to be the most hysterically precise expression of a lust for apocalypse ever given to the people. He described 2001 as so exquisite a tribute to the irrepressible life force, so touching a portrait of ever innocent mankind. These are not professional critics. Critics and scholars, I think, have a very different way of dealing with the film. But these are just, a little slapstick. See whether you're still awake. These are regular cinema goers. These are just people who saw the film. And thought, this is amazing. I have to write to this guy. Dear Mr. Kubrick. And they write. Another correspondent introducing herself, because you might think, it's all just guys writing. No, it's mixed. She introduces herself as a young wife and mother and wrote in May 1968 that after having recently seen both Paths of Glory in 2001, she felt that such films could, I quote, help your youngest generation develop a distaste for war rather than a direct association between war and manhood, valor, pride of country. This woman praised Kubrick's efforts toward human unity. Another letter from May 1968, this was probably someone who had some training, offered a Jungian interpretation of the film, referring to the first monolith as a phallic symbol and highlighting its connection with, I quote, the first appearance of knowledge. That is the discovery of, I quote, the first tool, a weapon. Hell's attack then symbolizes the fact that the knowledge acquired by humans, I quote, is turned against them. Yet at the end of the hero's Odyssey, I quote, the discovery is not of some strange new world, but of himself. The wisdom of age is his rebirth. Kubrick responded, thank you for your fascinating note. You're very perceptive indeed. The longest and most sophisticated letter Kubrick received, in his response he described it as overwhelming, concluded as follows. With 2001, you may have quite possibly saved any number of spiritual and physical lives. For 2001 implies much more than just an artistic revelation. It implies that if man is capable of this, he is capable of anything. How can man be content to consider the trivial and mundane when you have shown them a world full of stars, a world beyond the infinite? Now, the vast majority of the letters about 2001 that Kubrick received from men and women, children and adults, students and housewives, priests and astronauts were, like the ones I have cited, very positive. Relating this observation to reports in the trade press about the film's box office performance and to its critical reception has led me to conclude that 2001 was an immediate success with the majority of film reviewers, not the ones that are usually cited, but all the others that are never cited, and with an all-inclusive mass audience during its initial roadshow release, and that its close association with countercultural youth came about only later on. The film went on general release on 35mm at regular ticket prices in regular cinemas in 1969, was re-released on 70mm in 1970, and only then was the poster with the star child and the tagline, "The Ultimate Trip," used in 1970, when the film had long earned most of its money. And it stayed in movie theaters well into the 1970s, becoming one of the highest grossing films of all time at the US box office. Even today, Box Office Mojo's inflation-adjusted all-time chart of top-grossing movies in the United States ranks 2001 at number 146, with only two films from the late 60s, The Graduate, 67, and Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, 69, being placed higher. 146 doesn't tell you much, but when you think that from 66 to 69, only two films in the inflation-adjusted chart rank higher than 2001, that tells you something. And in the Internet Movie Database's users chart, it is currently at number 93, with only one film from the late 60s, Once Upon a Time in the West, above it. In addition to its enormous popularity, 2001 has also an outstanding critical reputation. When the American Film Institute last surveyed leaders from the American film community in 2007 about the greatest American films of all time, 2001 was ranked 15th. And in the most recent installment of Sight and Sound Survey of International Expert Opinion concerning the greatest films of all time, in 2012, 2001 was at number 6 in the critics poll and at number 2 in the directors poll. Thus, 2001: A Space Odyssey is still very much present in today's culture. In addition to many people's fond memories of the film and its easy accessibility through television broadcast, streaming services, as well as regular theatrical and DVD or Blu-ray re-releases, 2001 also has an extraordinarily strong indirect presence, insofar as the proliferation of science fiction blockbusters, with which Hollywood has come to dominate the global box office, can be traced back to the huge impact of Kubrick's film. The critical and commercial success of 2001 in the late 1960s and early 1970s did not immediately lead to a string of science fiction hits. But in 1977, George Lucas' Star Wars and Steven Spielberg's Close Encounters of the Third Kind took the genre to the global box office, to the top of the global box office charts, were spurred on by the success of Spielberg's E.T. the Extraterrestrial, 1982, a film that broke even the records set by Star Wars. It has stayed ever since. Importantly, both Lucas and Spielberg have acknowledged the influence of 2001 on their work, and also the concerns about nuclear war and environmental destruction, which overshadowed their childhood and youth in the 1950s and 1960s, and informed their filmmaking from the outset. The same is true for James Cameron. I'm now wrapping up my lecture. The writer, director, producer of science fiction blockbusters such as Terminator 2: Judgment Day, 1991, and Avatar, 2009. According to his biographer, Cameron's discovery at the age of 8 of a pamphlet about civilian fallout shelters and his subsequent realization that the world might come to a nuclear end at any moment in time was a formative experience which shaped much of his later work. And his decision to become a filmmaker was directly tied to the overwhelming impression that 2001: A Space Odyssey, which even today he names as his favorite movie, made on him in 1968. Now, from the Death Star's explosion of Alderaan in Star Wars to the nuclear conflagration initiated by Skynet in Terminator 2 and beyond, actual global destruction or the threat of such global destruction through weapons of mass destruction, hostile computers, alien invaders, asteroids, or other natural and unnatural causes has been central to many of the biggest global science fiction hits in recent decades. And that's what I want to conclude on, so has been a message of hope. Not for nothing did the first ever Star Wars movie acquire the subtitle A New Hope. And Sarah Connor's last words in Terminator 2 are, "The unknown future rolls toward us. I face it for the first time with a sense of hope. Because if a machine, a Terminator, can learn the value of human life, maybe we can too." By far the biggest global hit of recent years, Avatar, provides a depressing vision of the future of life on Earth. Although only a flashback to a scene set inside a building provides a brief glimpse of our planet, we learn from dialogue, "They killed their mother," that humans have destroyed the Earth's ecosystem. And they are now about to do the same on the distant moon Pandora. The intervention of a neural network of tree roots, worshipped by the natives as their goddess Ava, and also referred to as Mother, holds the progress of human destruction. And at the very end, one of the humans who has joined the battle on the side of the natives is reborn in an alien body. The last shot of the film's story shows him opening his eyes and staring directly into the camera. Like the conclusion of 2001: A Space Odyssey, the ending of Avatar thus suggests the possibility of fundamental transformation and challenges viewers to consider the implications of what they have seen for their own lives. This is a particularly urgent challenge at a time when fear of nuclear war has returned with a vengeance, and unchecked climate change is predicted to have utterly catastrophic consequences in the not-too-distant future. Perhaps more than ever before, we need, I quote, "a profound moral change of attitudes in men and nations, a transformation," I quote, "of the mind of man," which Stanley Kubrick, in his production notes for Dr. Strangelove, saw as the only chance for ensuring humanity's survival. Unfortunately, while films like 2001 or Avatar can provide us with a vision of what such a transformation might feel and look like, it is not always easy to see how we can make it happen in the world outside the movie theater. Thank you.